Hello, I'm John Baker, and this is my video transcript for our diagnostic assessment assignment, ADP 310. I'm in Tolleson Group 7 with Dr. Linda Newsom as our professor. In 1993, the martial arts world was exposed. The Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC for short, was created by Rorion Gracie and Campbell McLaren. The pay-per-view event was filmed in Colorado and featured a tournament of no-holds-barred, bare-knuckle fistfights in order to determine which style of martial arts was most effective. Boxers, shoot fighters, kickboxers, and even a sumo wrestler competed. The champion that emerged from the first event was the smallest man on the fight card, 170-pound Royce Gracie, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, used skills learned in Brazil to take down and submit all of his larger opponents. After the fights were complete, the martial art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu exploded onto the combat scene. Known affectionately as the gentle art due to the lack of striking techniques, BJJ is a grappling system that relies on leverage, positional dominance, joint locks, strangulations, and chokes. The premise of the art is that through technique, the smaller person can defeat the larger opponent. Royce Gracie proved this hypothesis correct in the first two UFC tournaments. Because Jiu-Jitsu is effective, the art has been incorporated into anti-bullying and self-defense seminars, military combative training, and law enforcement academies. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has a belt system, and in ascending order it goes white, blue, purple, brown, and black. It takes most people on average 10 years to achieve the rank of black belt. To be considered an expert, one must consistently train for a decade, honing skills and developing the capacity to survive a fight against any opponent. The assessment I chose to observe and analyze is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu belt assessment at my local school where I train. The school is named Danville Jiu-Jitsu Kickboxing and Wrestling Club and is located in Danville, California. As an educator that works in professional sports, I am using this example because, like baseball with the Cubs, the sport I teach professionally, it involves the understanding and application of physical skills. Since my learners range in age from 17 to 40 years old, I chose the assessment of a male subject in that age range. To relate the belt system to the academic one must consider each belt as a new grade, where teachers, or coaches in our case, must understand the capabilities of each student in order to determine if they are ready for the next belt. Obie and Sapp write, quote, "When a teacher starts a new academic year, they want to know many things about their students. One of the most important is their current level of academic performance." Close quote. Before an educator can figure out how best to teach his or her learners, he or she must first discover what the individual learner knows and can apply. Since there are no written tests on the grappling mat, physical assessments must be used. Jiu-Jitsu coaches are forced to come up with their own diagnostic assessments. After discussing the examination with the coach, I found correlations between his assessment methods and some of the key components of assessments as relating to educational psychology. Hall writes that, quote, "A sensible approach to tests and assessment tasks is to see them as indicators of achievement and not as a true representation of ability. I believe that the instructor's method of examination was sensible and productive as it indicated achievement." Because of the physical nature of the sport, the goal of training and practice is to learn physical skills. Coaches implement formative assessments with their students. Hall writes in Chapter 16 that assessment is formative when learners use information from the assessment to bridge the gap between what they can do and what they need to be able to do, or between what they know and what they need to know. The way this aspect of diagnostic assessment was done in my example was with a controlled sparring session between a black belt instructor and a white belt student. In Jiu-Jitsu terminology, sparring sessions are termed rolls, and I will use that term throughout the rest of this paper and presentation. The black belt has the skills required to put his or her student into difficult places in sparring to check their responses to the stimuli provided. I watched as the instructor gave opportunities for escape, submission, or positional change to the student. The other instructors then noted how the student responded. They were effectively assessing the student's level of skill and understanding of grappling with a real-life practical test. One of the adages of grappling is that the mat doesn't lie. The same process usually takes place on the first day of training for a new white belt student. The senior instructor will grapple playfully with them to assess what physical tools the student brings into the training environment. Obie and Sapp outline 4 specific aspects of assessment, beginning with, quote, "Prioritize content from the learning goals," end quote. The black belt gains an understanding of where the student must improve from this initial diagnostic role and can begin to determine how to best teach the student ways to mitigate the student's pre-existing habits and weaknesses. When it is time for a belt test, the instructor repeats that process. The second part of the belt test involved the student teaching 3 techniques to the class. They showed an offensive technique in the form of an armbar submission from the closed guard position. Second, they showed an escape technique from bottom mount. Third, they showed how to properly execute an armbar sweep from the guard position. Although they were only asked to teach 3 techniques, each technique was multifaceted in that the positions and intentions were different. Following the demonstration, the student was then asked with linking all 3 techniques together. The mount escape led to the armbar, which when defended led to the armbar sweep. Each individual element of the curriculum, when linked together, began to show a systematic understanding of grappling. Obie and Sapp referred to this process as measuring knowledge / understanding, quote, end quote, and intimate that, quote, usually 2 or 3 questions per learning goal are sufficient, especially when one is quite certain that students are not likely to have encountered the content of the unit before. In my case, the 3 techniques were the 2 or 3 questions that the learner is asked to answer. While the student had encountered the techniques individually, he had not been tasked with systematically linking them together. The assessment approach showed the gestalt nature of grappling. While each individual technique is effective, they are more effective when linked together. The whole was noticeably greater than the sum of the parts. The third and final part of the belt examination was by far the most brutal and physically demanding. After rolling with the instructor, then teaching techniques and linking them to a system, the student was forced to prove his defensive capacity with 30 consecutive minutes of defensive grappling. The student was placed on his back in bottom mount, a difficult position to escape, and the class was told to do whatever they could to submit the student. Placed in the worst possible position, the student was forced to show that not only did he understand defensive techniques and tactics, but that he could apply them under pressure. In their 4th bullet point, titled, quote, measuring skills, strategies, procedures, end quote, Obie and Sapp write, quote, measuring skills is crucial in disciplines where most learning is centered on performing specific skills, such as physical education, art, music, or dance, end quote. Martial arts are by description both a physical and artistic pursuit, and since the mat doesn't lie, those attempting to achieve a higher ranking must prove that their skills stand up under pressure. After 30 minutes that involved lots of sweat and a little blood, the student was awarded his blue belt and greeted with hugs and words of encouragement. He had officially survived what was called the Shark Tank. In reflecting on the assessment, I agree with the instructor's use of the diagnostic assessment tools. The instructor touched on 3 of the 4 areas described by Obie and Sapp and only failed to account for their 2nd bullet point, open quote, design and administer brief measures of top priority content, end quote. Because this was basically a final exam for a white belt, the top priority content was already covered in the initial evaluation when the student began his study over a year prior to the blue belt examination. In a way, because the instructors have gone through these tests themselves, they have the ability to provide their own assessment through generalizability theory. Because the instructor determines when the student is ready to participate in the belt exam, they can draw on knowledge of their own exams as well as the exams of students at a similar level of skill to the participant. The average results of these students is qualified by the lens of the instructor, and the instructor holds the authority to determine subjectively if the student is ready for the next rank. It is also possible to consider this assessment summative. Quote, summative assessments occur at defined periods of the academic year, such as the predetermined SAT tests, end quote, Obie and Sapp. The only difference here is that there is no timetable for when the assessment takes place. The black belts in jiu-jitsu that teach participate in roles with their students in a way that allows them to build knowledge about their students' progress. In this way, every day is like a quiz. And the final belt exam comes as a summary once the instructor feels that the student is ready. There is one specific aspect that I would change about the diagnostic assessment process in jiu-jitsu. It makes sense to me to incorporate classic test theory periodically before the larger belt assessment. It would make sense to offer more than one assessment where the student knows that he or she is being assessed. The theory, quote, states that a student's score received on a test or assessment is the result of a student's true score plus some error, end quote, Obie and Sapp. While the paragraph above links the belt test to a summative assessment, students aren't aware they are being tested. Assessing them periodically in a classical way, as an example once a month, would allow the students more feedback in order for them to learn quicker. This approach would be more complete because it would allow the student to better understand what the learning goals are and be more familiar with the belt examination. Implementing classical test theory would allow the instructor and student a more complete understanding of where the student is and what the student needs to learn to reach the next rank. Hall agrees that more data is better and writes, quote, the use of a variety of ways of assessing learning allows the production of evidence of learning from diverse contexts, thus avoiding making judgments about learning based on a single source of evidence, end quote. In conclusion, when it comes to diagnostic assessments, More information is always better.